Sound good? Cool. So just what we're going to go over is basically those goals. So just going over this agenda right now, sharing some about the Bennington story, the state's response, and then what we're doing legislatively in order to make sure that we close these loopholes to our toxics regulation, and then just leave the time at the end to take action. And I also just want to acknowledge that we're going to be videotaping this because there was a couple of requests from folks who wanted to see it but couldn't come today. So if anyone has any concerns, give me a thumbs up right now. But otherwise, we'll just keep with the recording.
You can only really see the people.
Perfect. Great.
Most of you are anonymous.
So I went over most about myself and about Toxics Action Center during the overview, but just to really quickly waves through these slides of just to see kind of how we've been working with the community groups down in Bennington, and really kind of coming out of the work that we've been doing down in Bennington, have been facilitating a nationwide coalition, the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, coming out of a conference that we organized with community group Testing for Peas in New Hampshire, and some academic partners like Silent Spring Institute and the Northeastern University, where we were able to pull together all these different community groups across the country who are facing PFAS drinking water contamination, and to push not just for state level change to lead the way, but actually also pushing for national change. And so I'm hoping to just say a few words about that at the end. So basically why we're all kind of getting together and why we're focusing in on this drinking water contamination issue around PFAS is because it shouldn't be our job, first of all, and second of all, we know that this is a problem. So PFAS is kind of designated as an emerging contaminant, meaning that that we're just finding out as the public about this contamination crisis. So I'm just going to spend about 5 minutes going into the emergence of these chemicals. But before I do, just want to talk a little bit about what these chemicals are. So had people heard about PFAS or PFOA before coming to this workshop today? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, cool. That's probably why you're here a little bit, but also some people who hadn't heard about it. Had you heard of C8? No? Okay, great. I just wanted to get a sense of where people are at. So the C8 molecule is the same thing as PFOA, which is the chemical that was found down in Bennington. And they're these long chain molecules. Sorry, I'm like also seeing it over there, and it's a little bit weird for me here. But they're these long chain fluorine molecules that make things not stick or not slip. So originally found in Teflon pans. People have been hearing, don't use Teflon pans. Don't use metal scrapers on Teflon pans. That's bad for your health. Unfortunately, these same chemicals are also used in all these nonstick fabrics. So carpets, Vortex jackets, inside of microwave popcorn bags, and anywhere that they're used, anywhere that they're manufactured, that those chemicals got into the air, landed around these different factories, these different manufacturing factories, and got into people's drinking water in much higher concentrations than what we found from people who just were eating the popcorn from these microwave popcorn bags. And so these are long chain molecules, so they persist in our environment for a really long time. So we've been hearing about BPA, which you're not supposed to drink out of BPA bottles, because that goes through your system in a couple of hours. These chemicals stay in your body for 4 to 6 years. And so for people who are ingesting really high quantities of it, it can cause a lot of adverse health impacts. Sorry, I'm not doing a good job following this here. So everything from low birth weight to kidney disorders, testicular cancer, kidney cancer. Basically, what we were hearing from folks at the NIEHS at the federal level was, you can think of a health disorder, PFAS is one of the things that could cause it. It's really horrible for folks' health. So just a little bit more about kind of why we shouldn't have to be dealing with this. So back in the 1950s, DuPont and 3M made these chemicals, and they did some of their own internal testing. And the women who were on these lines found that were making these chemicals found that their kids were having birth defects. And they reported this to the companies. The companies did their own health studies and found that yes, that these chemicals were causing health impacts for their workers. And instead of taking action, instead of doing a full reporting and evaluation to the EPA, instead they just moved these women off of that line. And so for decades, this information was largely hidden from the public. And so, not a mistake that when we got the call, from Alyssa back in 2016, I never heard about these chemicals before. And so how the chemicals really started coming into the national consciousness was following a case down in West Virginia, where a farmer found that his cattle herd was falling really, really sick, and that there's a lot of birth defects, serious birth defects in the community. And so there was a significant lawsuit which ended in a study, a health study, which is called the C8 study. If folks are interested in getting really nitty-gritty into the details about these chemicals, the C8 study is definitely the place to start. And coming out of these studies, it really led to a much bigger awakening and push for closing down these chemicals, closing down the factories that were using and manufacturing these chemicals. And so this kind of really ended with a front page New York Times Magazine cover story about this case in West Virginia. And right along the same time too, we were hearing about what was happening in Flint. We were hearing about a lot of different drinking water contamination crises. And that's kind of when everything really, months later was when we found out about the drinking water contamination here in Bennington in Vermont. So sorry that was really, really quick, but I will just pause there and see if there's like one or two questions before moving into the Bennington story. Cool? Great. So I'm going to hand it over to Lauren really quick for just one now, or should we wait for later on the regulations?
I can do a quick, sorry.
Yeah.
So I think Shana had just asked me, I'm talking about the kind of Vermont policy response in a few minutes, but the kind of big picture of these chemicals are, we have this situation where federally, at the same time, back in the 70s when our big laws were put in place, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the law that was supposed to be protecting us from toxic chemicals is called the Toxic Substances Control Act. So that was passed in 1976, and essentially since it was put in place, it's been a largely dysfunctional law, unfortunately. There are right now on the market about 85,000 plus registered chemicals. So there's these, chemicals, 1,000 plus are manufactured each year or put out to the market. And what the EPA did when they put TSCA into place was, first of all, they grandfathered in about 60,000 chemicals. So chemicals that were in existence at the time, like PFOA, were grandfathered from new health testing. At the same time, there's just been a huge lack of health testing overall of chemicals. So we're basically used as guinea pigs. Chemicals are put on the market and they're presumed innocent until proven guilty, which works for criminal justice, but is a terrible system for chemicals where companies are able to profit off them. But in the meantime, we essentially have to prove that there's a problem with them to then trigger potential regulations. And it's proven extremely challenging to actually regulate those chemicals. So in the history of TSCA, only 5 chemicals were ever regulated. Under that framework. They tried to do asbestos, and pieces of it were basically thrown out of court because they said it's basically set up this cost-benefit analysis where, is it going to be too costly to industry to regulate it? And so the whole framework of it just has been unworkable. There was a new law passed in 2016 federally to try to get a better system in place. There were some good things, some bad things as part of that. It had some potential, but unfortunately with the Trump administration coming in, they're the ones now doing the implementation of that. And so, and they've put in place, from Scott Pruitt, who's a fossil fuel industry funded person, to the people actually running the chemical programs are former chemical industry lobbyists. One of them, in fact, worked to defend PFOA and was saying, as a toxicologist, he's like, these aren't problematic, and so he literally is coming from a background of being an industry lobbyist on behalf of these chemicals. So in terms of what kind of federal response we're seeing, unfortunately it's not encouraging right now. I'll talk later about the possibilities of what we can do at the state level, which You know, there's a lot of steps that we can take to better protect ourselves, so I'll dig in there. But that's the kind of context we're looking at for the regulations federally that leave us vulnerable.
Thanks, Lauren. Sorry to put you on the spot there. But next I want to invite up Jim Goodine, who's a Bennington resident since 1971, and is a veteran here on Veterans Day of U.S. Submarine Services, and also president of Blue Heron Construction Company since 1985, and owner of a development that's directly adjacent to the former ChemFab plant, and is a former board member of several other local municipal boards. So I'm going to have you come on up. Jim, thanks.
I'm not much of a public speaker. I'm not like
What do you mean stay seated?
I don't have to read, so bear with me. Yeah, I want to thank you for showing up to, and your interest in this, because it's been difficult getting people to be interested, and in our local area, you can imagine everybody's pretty interested, but. Those of you who are familiar with the Bennington area, our development is between Bennington College and the former ChemFab plant. And if you were standing in our development, it's on a bit of a hillside. We bought it because it's a south-facing hillside, and we had a concentration in energy efficiency and solar construction since the mid-70s. And if you stood on the edge of our property where it goes down towards the river, you're looking down the stacks of this factory. And I think that someplace here with a picture, I don't know how to move things forward or back. Here, I'll let you come to it. I still use a flip phone.
Yeah, there you go.
And yeah, this is the road, Water Street, that comes down. It turns the corner here, and it goes down. And our development is, if you can see a little bit more over here, our development's right up here. So we were looking right down into these cooling towers. And when we first bought the property in the mid, was it 1986? We bought the property. You could smell it once in a while, but I'm from Maine. You know those pulp mills up there, as they always say, that smells like jobs to us. And so I didn't really pay much attention to it. You'd get a whiff of this once in a while. And when I asked the factory about it, they said, well, it's like the starch you use in your shirt, And well, I knew it wasn't, but, and then it got worse and worse, and by the late 90s, it was unbearable. You couldn't be outside for more than an hour. You'd get a roaring headache that would last for 2 or 3 days. It was awful. And the guys who were working there, and I knew a lot of the people working there, a lot of those guys would come home and they called it the ChemFab shakes. And they would be shaking when they came home from work, and in the morning they'd go back to work again. And inconceivable to me, but anyway, the smell got so bad that I had to do something about it. And we were working on our utilities, and we were getting our roads in and our underground utilities done and so forth. And then by the mid-90s, we were talking to them about emission reduction. In '99, it started formal conversations to get emissions reduced. The smell was so bad you couldn't work outside, and if you did, you'd get a roaring headache. So I called the state. I put EPA here, but it's not EPA, it's
DEC.
Okay.
Department of Environmental Conservation.
Yeah, DEC, I knew that. I don't know why I wrote EPA here. At the time, and I didn't know this, but Vermont Digger had some really interesting articles. If you have a chance to look those up, there's a 4-part series on this. The Dean administration said, hey, these are good jobs. Let's back off a little bit here. Yeah. Now I think I'm putting it probably too clearly, but I think that's exactly what happened. And so when I contacted the state on that, they said, well, I wanted them to come down and I wanted them to test the air. Then they said we wouldn't do that. We would test the soil because if it's in the air, it'll end up in the soil. So I said, well, come on down. They said, well, no, we don't have the manpower for that. And I said, well, could you come down some night, because mostly it was at night, when it's really powerful. come down and have, you know, no, we can't do that with another manpower for it. And I said, what if I hired a local engineer to come and do all of this? Yeah, well, no, we really don't want to get involved in this. And I said, well, I'm trying to work this out. You know, I went to their office and told the manager I need to resolve this, and they said they'd call. No, they didn't call. I contacted someone I knew on their board, and I said, told him the story. He said, call them afternoon tomorrow, and they will take your call, which I finally got to talk to their general manager. And to say that it was a heated conversation, you see, the state had told me, if you nudge these guys, they'll shove you. And if you shove them, they'll hit you with a truck. And within 5 minutes of talking to these guys, he said, you're threatening me? I said, I'm not threatening you. I'm not threatening you. I want to talk to you about this problem that we need to work out. And I said, but if I threaten you, you'll be the first to know, because I'm not going to back off on this. So let's work this out. State was still not interested. I brought it up to them multiple times, multiple letters, no action. And then let's see, they somewhat reduced their emissions. And I said, it's not good enough. He said, well, we've got the same situation over in New Hampshire. We don't have any complaints. I said, no, you don't have the same situation. First of all, this factory is down in a hole. We're looking right down your stacks. Second of all, and the one over in New Hampshire is on the top of a hill. Secondly, in New Hampshire, they have wet scrubbers on both their towers. On your towers, you have a dry scrubber, and you have no scrubber on one of your towers. And consequently, you've had a fire in that one tower several times. In fact, right at the time, they had one sitting in the driveway that was all burned out. So he said, well, how do you know that? It was like, I said, I just sent away and got your permit from the state. You have a permit in both states. It's right there in black and white. So I said, I don't know. I don't like to be bamboozled, but I'm telling you, we got to do something about this. And he said, well, you're going to cost 140 people their jobs. I said, first of all, it's going to be 79 people. I know how many people work there. I've got a lot of friends working there. And second of all, I'm not going to cost them their jobs. You are costing them their jobs by not going by the rules here. So I said, you know, if it was smelling the way it was in 1985, we wouldn't be talking. But no, you have to keep ramping it up. You've got a successful business. You can't produce this stuff fast enough. And so consequently, they moved out of town. And I kept hearing, oh, geez, we feel so bad about ChemFab. I said, I don't feel bad about ChemFab being gone. Why don't you move over there, if you liked your job so much, move over to New Hampshire and live next to that polluting guy? No, nobody went, not one person from Bennington went over there. And so I don't blame them. You know, I wasn't going to have a development next to that factory over there either. So, so I don't know if anybody, let's see. So anyway, at the moment, my situation right now is that I've still got lots in my development. I can't do anything at all. In fact, I was planning to move there myself, took my house off the market because I can't go there. You can't drill a hole down into that mess right now. We've got to wait until the state has pressured them. State started it actually already to get our water system run up there. Fortunately, unlike Hoosick Falls, our public water system is not polluted. It's our wells that are polluted. Hoosick Falls, they've got a giant problem over there. And I would also like to mention that it was not anybody from either of the states that picked up on this problem. It was an individual from Hoosick Falls whose father had died of cancer, and he decided on his own, with his own money, to get water tested and find out what was going on. That triggered the whole thing. And so we kind of piggybacked on that. And I will say, you know, Commissioner Shuren was great. What they were struggling with in New York, we were able to just move right forward on it, and everything happened very quickly. But thank you for that. So I don't know, and I'll close a little bit here by saying, does anyone here remember the newspaper article that said North Bennington was identified as the best place to raise children? Boston Globe. Not anymore. So That's, you know, I'm interested in answering any questions, but I'll tell you, I'd make myself available afterwards, and my email is all in the information that you got today, I think, and please contact me if you need to. I can shut up now.
Thanks, Jim. So next I'd like to invite Representative Morris. So originally from Chicago, Representative Kaya Morris lives in Bennington, where she serves in the state's legislature as a representative. She's the first African-American and person of color elected from Bennington County, and the second African-American to be elected in the General Assembly in nearly 30 years. And in that capacity, she serves on the House Judiciary Committee and Judicial Nominating Board, and is co-chair of the Tripartisan Legislative Women's Conference. She's also co-chair of Communications and Development with the TESA Collaborative, and she primarily serves as the, previously served as the director of the Alliance of Community Transformations, regional community-based public health collective. And among other things is also a rights and democracy leader, Emerge Vermont alum, and advisor to Black Lives Matter Vermont. So thanks, Kaya.
So I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here and thanking Jim for coming and telling your story. It's been a crazy journey. It feels like it's a million years long, but it's not. It was just a moment ago. And hearing Jim talk about his experiences, it just brings back those triggers of so much of the pain that happened as this story began to unfold. So my connection to this entire process began with an email. So as Jim spoke of, over the same company, Saint-Gobain, had a factory over in Hoosick Falls, which is literally on Bennington, Vermont's border. You could jog across it and get there if you wanted to. Many of our family and friends share, you know, so many connections working cross borders in that way. And they were rocked with a very horrible situation, a lot of collusion, feeling very reminiscent of Flint, where their water was polluted, their public water was polluted because of the work of ChemFab. Their state, you know, they went through their own process. Erin Brockovich came down and was like, let's go have a talk. And what struck me about that, and the reason why I'm just making this little asterisk on this moment, was I remembered when they announced that Erin Brockovich was going to come and talk about the water quality issues that were happening in New York. The talk itself happened at Bennington College in North Bennington, which was right next to the ChemFab property, as we saw in the previous pictures. And I said, why would she go here? They have a huge armory. They could have absolutely had that community meeting right within the community. And so my mind, you know, sort of put that away, but said, she's a pretty smart lady with a lot of people that work for her. I wonder if there's something more to this. Shortly after that, we received an email. Our county delegation, our senators, our state senators, and our representatives got an email from a woman who used to live in Bennington and now lived in upstate New York. But she saw what was happening in Hoosick Falls and said, that same company has a plant in North Bennington, and many people have talked about health issues. I'm just asking the question, are you all looking into that at all? What do you think is happening with that? I'm just hoping everything will be okay. I represent Bennington, and North Bennington is a separate community, and I only represent half of Bennington. No one responded. And that bothered me a lot. And I said, well, you know, part of our job is to do our due diligence. And I actually felt fortunate because within the role that I had working in public health, I was actually literally placed at the Bennington County Regional Planning Commission, who has the municipal charge and the state charge of dealing with our water quality issues, with maintaining and monitoring what's happening with our water, and looking at these very issues of environmental concerns. And so I said, well, I'm just gonna ask. I'd rather find out that there's nothing to worry about than that we never asked the question. So I sent off the email to them, and they said, we haven't thought about this. Let me see what we can do. So the first two people that responded, one of them was the director, Jim Sullivan, of the program, of the commission. And so he reached out to the DEC, and they started having these conversations. Well, it turned out as they started doing these investigations that the pollution levels were far worse than we ever could have imagined. And community members like Jim started coming forth with story upon story upon story of the horrors of how these pollutions took place, these environmental crimes took place. And Jim himself has property that has some of the highest levels of any group. So both Jims are sitting there facing what was once their dream home that is now their nightmare. So within the state of Vermont, our standards are exceptional. They're unconventional for the nation because we use a sense of harm of saying if it harms a child, if it would harm a baby, then it's harmful. So where some communities may start at 200 levels, parts per trillion, we were at 20. Jim Sullivan's house had almost 2,000. And he said, thank you, Kaya, for reaching out, because dear God, I wouldn't have even known. I would have never known that this was an issue. So as I started talking to some of the community members about this process, and as this started going, it became this like swell of energy, and the state was there. They were like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Toxic action said, oh my God, what are we gonna do? People started saying, what are we going to do? How do we deal with this? We don't even know what we're talking about yet, but we know that there's something wrong. And we all had this sense, and anecdotally in the Bennington area, that there was something very wrong, because you could throw a rock at a house and hit someone whose almost entire family had died of cancer. It was not unusual at all, and complex cancers, not just a standard cancer. They had 2 or 3 cancers. Our issues of thyroids, so many health problems in this community that may or may not, we now know, be linked to this PFOA, but it was one of those things like something is not right. And here we started having this dialogue. And one of the people that reached out to me the most, that talked quite a bit, and you'll see her story within the press when you do look at the stories. She worked at the company at the time and said, you know, I remember a few really key things happening. I remember an incident where we were working inside and the toxic levels became so high inside the building that all the executives went upstairs and locked the doors and left us down there. I remember when the community put together petitions and put pressure on them to try to deal with the black smoke that was billowing out of their chimneys, and they made the choice to raise the stacks and do double production at night so that the smoke would disappear into the night sky without people seeing it. And she said, and here I am now, and I'm disabled for the rest of my life. And I worked in that place. And this is what it has done. So when we had our community meeting to try to come to reckoning with what the heck had happened, I can't tell you how hard it was to be in that space and see so many people with such fear, such pain, such invalidation, such hopelessness, because there was something so far beyond their control that was crushing their lives, and they didn't have answers. So we moved. The state moved on it. They took it seriously. The governor took it seriously. The DEC took it seriously. Our universities and colleges said, how can we help? And they started a whole campaign to try to think about how can we support the data collection that's needed right now in order to get our hands around what it even means, and not leaving it just up to the state to clean it up or just our municipality to find a solution, so that we could all work really actively on this together. So this experience is something that people are still feeling the ripple effects for. And yes, we did reach a settlement with Saint-Gobain, and it felt tenuous at times, as they always do, because it's a corporation. But the people who bought it, Saint-Gobain bought it off of the previous owners with the full knowledge that something could happen. That's part of that calculated risk that happens within corporations and when you do corporate buying. So I think they knew that there might be a question raised, but whether or not they would prevail was always the gamble. And we fought back, and I'm so proud and so glad that we did. And so now, just to bring things full circle, we are at the point where we're looking to get people connected up to our municipal water supplies. But there's still a fear. There's still a real fear, and until people are hooked into there, even though we have these POET systems, these fantastic systems that are scrubbing their wells, they still don't trust it. And why should they? Right? When they've been lied to so much. And even though it's not the state lying to them, their own life experiences are really throwing this into question. So it's understandable that there's so much pain happening, and it happens in beautiful here, green Vermont, in a beautiful green Vermont. So I went to college at the University of Illinois. This has nothing to do with this picture. I wanted to show the poet. There's probably some spaces like that down there. I'm sure at the bottom of our armory there. But I just wanted to say that it was one of the heartbreaks for me to see this new ad that they're putting out to support and promote that community, the Champaign-Urbana community. And anyway, so within that, they were like, we have all this great stuff, this technology, we have an international community, we have all this food, and oh, did we mention we have some of the cleanest water in the country? I would love to be able to make that ad. I would love to be able to say that, and I feel like we deserve to be able to use that as a marketing tool. And I'm glad that we're working towards trying to make that happen. But there's a lot more work to be done because there's communities throughout our state that are all dealing with these issues now. So I think that was my time. So, thank you. Thank you.
We have a couple more folks who are going to be talking more about the other different processes that we went through, so I think I'm going to hold off on the questions about what happened in Bennington.
This is not a question, this is a bit of an aside, but about 10 years ago I read a book called An Unreasonable Woman, Diane Wilson, and I was so appalled. Those are the kind of things that were happening in Houston, and I thought, oh, thank God I live in Vermont. Wow, going no.
Is it okay if I keep going on? Or, yeah, okay, we'll have time for that at the end. We're booking it here. So next I want to invite up Alyssa Shuren, who prior to joining, is currently a partner at the Management Center. And prior to joining, she served as a commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, directing a $100 million department of 300 employees and leading the implementation of Lake Champlain cleanup and moving towards universal recycling, as well as spearheading the Bennington drinking water contamination crisis. She also worked as Environment America's Development Director and formerly as Toxic Action Center's Executive Director. So welcome, Alyssa. Thank you.
Yeah, talk about being in the right place at the right time, I feel like, in a way. Having been the Executive Director of Toxic Action Center and having spent so many years, 8 years, working with communities where the government wasn't responding to their concerns, and then being the commissioner of the department at the moment that communities were really facing a drinking water crisis was a really, it was a silver lining, for me, at least in the way, to be able to be responsive. And I really do want to thank Jim, Toxic Action Center Representative Morris, for your leadership there. I mean, really, this wouldn't have happened without your leadership, without your story. And it wouldn't be getting better in the state of Vermont without the leadership of VCV and VPIRG and Toxic Action Center and Representative Morris to turn it into policy to make sure this doesn't keep happening to communities moving forward. Because you realize when you get into government, and I knew going in, but government officials are there to implement the laws that we have in the books. And when the laws aren't protective enough, you're in a situation that you can respond as best you can, and I'll talk about that response. And I am proud of that response, and it has been held up by Aaron Brockovich and others across the country saying it was one of the best, if not the best, response in the country. And that is great, and Vermont should be doing that. Yeah. And Vermont should be doing that. But it's not enough. It's not enough. People were poisoned for decades. That's not good enough. And so that's why the action portion of this conversation is so critical moving forward. Okay, so a couple things I just want to talk about. The Environmental Department of Environmental Conservation that I was commissioner of, that oversees all the pollution control laws. So the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, that was my jurisdiction that I was managing. And ChemFab was owned by a company called Saint-Gobain, you say with the accent, but Saint-Gobain is what a lot of people in America say. But it's a French company that calls Saint-Gobain, is what a lot of people call it. And you heard about this facility operating. It's shuttered now. It's been closed for, I don't even know how many years, like a decade or more.
2002.
2002, yeah. So on February 25th, 2016, I was in my office preparing to go down and testify at the State House on a permit process improvement bill. So I was like reviewing my talking points in my office, and all of a sudden Chuck Schwer, who's the head of the Waste Management Prevention Division in my office, comes like bolting in. And I had known that we were doing testing in Bennington because we had been asked to do testing in Bennington. And of course I was like, do it. Let's see what's going on. And he comes in and he said, we got the test results back. And I immediately knew this was not good. I'm looking at him, he's got red-faced, he's standing over me. I sat up straighter in my chair and I was like, what is it? And he like walked me through the results, and the thing that struck me about the results, we had taken 6 samples, is that we took a bunch of samples around the facility. I had expected those to come back contaminated. Now that when I learned about the problem and I looked at the landscape and I learned the background, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had come back contaminated. But we had taken, about a mile away, we had taken another sample at the wastewater treatment facility, which we had thought, I would have considered that our sentinel well. That would have been the clean one. And somewhere between, we would have figured out, we would have drawn a circle and figured it out, you know, logically where the contamination was. But that one was contaminated. And so at that point, I had a real question of like, where is the contamination? What is going on? It was such a blessing that the municipal water supply, which was like miles away and like the foothills of the mountains, was clean. And so, you know, if we knew right away, okay, if we can switch people to water supply, we can address that. But all these hundreds of homes that were on thousands of people impacted by this, by contamination, what are we gonna do for them? So I went down to the State House. I'm still thinking I'm going to testify at this point on the permit process, permit bill, but I was going to go get the governor. And Vermont's so small, and I knew he was in the ceremonial office. So I go in, and I know he's in a meeting. I'm like standing outside the door, and I told his chief of staff, like, I got to get in there. Like, I don't care what is going on. This is like a big deal, and he's got to know about it. And we have to, and I need to be able to act now. Like, I'm not going to wait. I knew what was going on in Hoosick Falls. I was like, I am not waiting another minute before we take action on this. So like, I got to get in there. They broke up his meeting, and I went in and I got the right people on the phone, and we, you know, pulled the right people together, and we started telling the legislators, we brought them in, briefed them before anyone else knew. We started calling the town officials to tell them, because the governor, to his credit, he's like, what's the plan? And I like laid out the plan, and I said, you know, I want to go down there within 24 hours, I want to hold a community meeting, I want to share all the information with folks, I want to figure out a way to get bottled water in there right away, I want to coordinate with the National Guard, I want to have an information center that I want to stand up in the community, and I want to do this all by Monday, and this was Thursday. And he was like, great, let's do it. He's like, let's do it. To his credit, he's like, tell me how I can help. I'm like, okay, well, let's just check in 30 seconds. We got to get like the press release out and whatever. So we're trying to call the right people and let them know so they hear it first before we release it to the public. But within 2 hours, we were standing there announcing those results. And what we had found, one of the levels that we had found was the standard was 20 parts per trillion, the health advisory level. We found one well at 2,880 parts per trillion. It was and is shocking. So within 24 hours, we're down at the community. This is North Bennington. These are some pictures of that night. And for folks that were there, you know, it is the first community meeting that I had been to where I was there an hour and a half early and people were already there. I was like, it's an hour and a half before the start time and people are here. And we also didn't know what to say. We didn't know where the contamination was. And I get it with, you know, state officials. You're expected to know everything all the time. You're expected to have the answers immediately. And we did not have the answers. Like, we did not know how far the contamination was. And I had a whole debate with my team, who are professional experts in this area, you know, in contamination area. And they said, you know, we work out methodically in small rings over time to figure out. And I said, yeah, I know, but that's going to take months. And these people have been poisoned for like decades. So we basically need to figure out a way that's like a combination to let you do your important work, your methodical work, by also being immediately protective and not having these people continue to drink contaminated water. So eventually we decided, you know, it was kind of a tense discussion because it's like, you know, I'm talking to a scientist, I'm talking to an engineer, I'm like, you know, an organizing environmental advocacy background. We're having a very interesting conversation in the car the whole way down, and finally I was like, okay, it sounds like a mile and a half is probably the best guess, because they're like, if you went a mile, it could be this, but we could be wrong, and you know, and I just went, I'm drawing a circle on the map. It's a mile and a half. You're saying it's your best professional judgment? That's all we got? This was like 10 minutes before we started. There's a map on the wall. You can't see here. There's a map on the wall. And I'm like, I have a Sharpie in my purse, and I'm going to draw the circle, or you can. And they were like, I'll draw a circle. We're drawing a circle. We drew it on the map. And I started the meeting and just said, we don't have the answers. But this is what we're going to do, and we're going to figure it out with you every step of the way, and we're going to get drinking water in here, and we're going to have that in here by Monday. And so we started down the path of the response. But the second we set, I mean, there were hundreds of people there, standing room only, people pouring out into the, and people very scared, like people crying, like moms holding babies, like people terrified. And the second we said that we were going to provide free drinking water, and to their credit, the responsible party, which we didn't know was responsible or not at the time, because you have to say potential responsible party till you can prove it, obviously, but we said the potential responsible party did pay for that water. But I had an environmental contingency fund that I could use for emergency response. So I was like, whether they're paying for it or not, this Vermont, we created this pot of money just for situations like this. So we started using it. We moved things. These are pictures from the response. We set up the information center. We brought in the bottled water. We got the governor down there to do a tour a couple different times. In Hoosick Falls, across the line in New York, the governor hadn't gone there, and it had been, 2 years or something. The governor hadn't gone down there to meet with the community, and Governor Shumlin had gone twice by the time that, and she basically shamed the governor of New York to go down there. And so our response, it was like 10 miles apart, but it was a pretty different experience. We were set up like an emergency response structure. I don't know if you've ever had to go through this, but we used the FEMA incident command structure. I mean, we had a 24-hour operation going on with like hotline. We brought in the Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. We were running the operation on the ground. We had hundreds of, homes impacted, and people were angry, and rightly so. Angry, furious angry, and rightly so. This is what it looked like when we started testing. You can see the red dots were the worst, the highest, and the blue dots were the non-detects. But this is where the facility was. This is the 1.5 mile radius. We did expand a couple different places. This is a landfill over here. So we started realizing that was another potential concern. And so this is what it looked like at that point. So we started thinking about where else should we be testing? It's not just probably here, because it's not only it wasn't only ChemFab that used these chemicals. The chemicals were used, as you saw, in cleaning products and clothing manufacturing, all these things. And so we started doing testing all across the state. We found it in Pownell, in their public water supply in Pownell Fire District 2. There was 400 people that were impacted there. We did create a new water system there, and they're now filtering, and they now have clean water. It was the quickest turnaround system that we ever had done as the state of Vermont. We also started testing at every wire coating industry, semiconductor industry, firefighting foam, where they use firefighting foam, tanneries, landfills, wastewater treatment facilities. We did a map of everywhere that we thought it had been, and we found it. A bunch of different places, but in no other community were residents impacted in this way. Like at the military bases, we found it, but it was all on the base. Or at one, the people are mostly on public water, and the public water we found was clean, which was great for the most part. So this is a little bit about the response, but like I said, it's really not enough. It gets to the policy. It was great that we could respond like we did, but it's not, it doesn't give you a high level of confidence that people are protected when you can't get ahead. Like when we're putting chemicals on the market without being tested, that needs to change. We need to be testing chemicals before they go on the market, just like we do our pharmaceuticals. There's a whole problem with the pharmaceutical industry for sure, but at least they test those for years and try to put them on the market in a safe way. We don't, we're not even trying in the way that we should, at the level we should be with the chemical industry, and so and with chemicals going to the market. So anyway, thank you so much. I'm sure I went over my time, but I feel like I should wrap it up, and I'll be happy to take questions after.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was a perfect segue to go over to Lauren. So Lauren Hurl joined VCV, the Vermont Conservation Voters, as the political director in 2014. And prior to that, worked as an environmental advocate at VPIRG and in DC at the National Audubon Society, and has run a whole bunch of other campaigns and is now doing a lot of the work around the toxics legislation. So welcome, Lauren. I'm just gonna pull this up. How do I pull that though? You can,
Let's see if I can probably figure it out. Slideshow.
from beginning. Boom.
Let's see if that works. So I am really appreciative that you're all here today listening to us, and so appreciate hearing the stories of the people in the community dealing with it. Commissioner Shuren at the time, who has been this, as everyone's heard, had this really groundbreaking response, I think set the bar for Vermont and other states to meet for how we respond. But at the same time, as she pointed out and we've heard, this is unfortunately probably the tip of the iceberg, both as we discover, nationally we're discovering these perfluorinated chemicals all over the place. There's also, as I mentioned, a lot of chemicals out there. This is not the only emerging contaminant, not the only contaminant we know about. So from my seat, I was hearing about all of this in the State House, was testifying on that same bill on permit reform when we got the news, and I was sitting in the State House and dealing kind of on the legislative front. So what could we do? And to our legislators' good credit, they really sprang into action as well, thinking, how did this happen and what can we do to prevent this kind of contamination? Look across the state at who else might be affected. What are the gaps in our policies that allow this to happen in the first place? At this point, it's coming into March. Our session is usually January to early May or so. It's really late to do, okay, here's a policy idea. Let's get it from start to finish and actually pass it. So essentially, in 2016, what they did was, let's set up a working group and have that working group do a really deep dive into our chemical policy overall. So it was great to see it wasn't just, what can we do for the Bennington response? That's important that, all the work was going on through DEC, but it was also recognizing right away that this is a bigger problem and let's take a holistic view at how are these chemicals coming into our state for manufacturers. They're coming in products that then are in our homes and our schools and our workplaces. So they were really looking kind of broadly at that. So a number of people were put on this working group. I was on this working group. And some of the people in the room might have been as well. But it had business folks looking at it from their angle. It had scientists. It had public health advocates, environmental advocates, a lot of the agency staff. And really, we were looking, again, at the whole suite of policies and doing a deep dive into, what are we doing in Vermont? We've got the federal context, a whole bunch of federal laws that kind of touch on chemicals, and then state laws and programs, and what's working well and what's not working well, and where are the gaps, and how can we improve what we're doing to better protect people from PFOA and other toxic chemicals. And what we came up with were a whole suite of recommendations that the group, including the business groups and everyone, every idea wasn't unanimous, but we got majority support for a whole bunch of ideas that were then put forward. So those ideas, which I'll describe in a minute, but essentially they were put into proposed legislation. So coming into this year in 2017, there were two bills that were brought in. One was Bill S10, which was really a kind of narrowly tailored bill, but looking at the negotiations that were going on to get the public water line extension paid for by the responsible party. So a bill passed this year and was signed into law that was kind of pushing on that process and making sure that the responsible party would pay for that. So that was a kind of short-term win. Broader, there was legislation, S103, that was looking at the whole suite of ideas that this working group had come up with. So it was introduced and it was 100 pages long, all kinds of ideas. Unfortunately, this year, as I'm sure you all remember, we came in, we had a new governor, we had a new Speaker of the House, a new Senate President. There was kind of slow moving getting going on a whole number of fronts. So, as all of us are kind of reeling from the federal election and what's happening and are like, we need bold action in Vermont. Like, Vermont, on a lot of issues that we're talking about today at this conference, they were kind of slow to get going on. In parks, I think just this new leadership and everyone getting their feet under them. And this was one of the bills that got kind of a slow start, and they just picked up a couple of the ideas that we had looked at. One of them was an interagency committee. It was kind of recognizing that in the state of Vermont, there's a whole bunch of agencies that deal with chemicals. Alyssa mentioned the emergency management and DC, Department of Health, and they don't really talk. And there was this general sense of we need to do better just coordinating among ourselves. And part of that is looking at, we need a better idea of which chemicals are being used where. So, when you're doing the response, like Alyssa was describing of, where has PFOA ever been used in the state? What about other similar chemicals? It was hard to do that. It was a lot of guesswork, and trying to just get a better inventory and tracking of the chemicals in the first place was one of the ideas. So setting up this interagency committee to look at that. Another idea that was put forward was looking at our toxics use reduction program. So we have a program on the books in the state that is supposed to be working with manufacturers to say, let's work together and figure out how you can use fewer toxic chemicals in your manufacturing processes. There's a lot of room for improvement, or it seemed like from what we could tell it was basically a paper exercise. A lot of the reports sit in shelves on paper somewhere, and for a public person to try to find out which chemicals are being used in my community, how is this program being implemented? There's lots of room for improvement there. So that was one of the ideas that came out as well. Another idea that we were looking at related to testing drinking water wells. So a lot of people, as we heard in Bennington, a lot of people in Vermont have private drinking water wells. So our public systems are tested for a whole host of potential contaminants. Private drinking water wells, on the other hand, there's recommendations that they be tested. So when you sell your house and so on, but it's actually not mandated. And so this, it seems like kind of shocking that this isn't a requirement already, but this is just putting in place that when you drill a new well, test for certain toxic contaminants. And so that is part of what was moved forward in the Senate. So essentially the Senate passed those two big pieces, this interagency committee looking at a bunch of things, well water testing, sent it over to the House. The House then did some good work looking at a program that we have on the books to try to identify certain toxic chemicals that are being used in kids' products. And so that's information being reported to the state now in a program that was passed in 2014. There's lots of opportunity to improve that program, both how is the information being reported so it's actually user-friendly for families, and then also to make it easier for the Commissioner of Health to actually restrict the use of toxic chemicals in kids' products. So there was some language making that program work better that the House passed. It got kind of, my next thing. Okay, so this was it. What wasn't the thing? So, despite contaminated wells, toxic spill falls short in Montpelier. We tried to do this press conference with this 20-foot-tall baby bottle and all this stuff, trying to get attention for the issue on the final days of the session. But it ended up stalling out. It was sent back to the Senate. They needed to take one more vote to send it to the governor's desk. Unfortunately, these kinds of bills, they bring in intense opposition. So, I work on a whole range of issues, clean water, clean energy, all kinds of stuff. And I don't see anything like I see on these bills, where you've got people flying in from all over the country because they see that if you're going to try to go after these chemicals, these are hugely lucrative products for these industries. PFOA has made billions of dollars for the companies. And so there's this huge profit incentive to stop little Vermont from taking some action that's going to inhibit their use. And so, the flock of lobbyists that come into the room when we're trying to work on these bills to protect people's health is really incredible, and it makes passing these bills really challenging. And that's where, being able to get the voices of Vermonters saying, remember us, we're your constituents, this is our health, these are our communities, our families, is so important because our legislators are under intense pressure when these kinds of bills come up to just say, let's leave it to the federal government and let's just put this aside. We did have a ton of support on this bill. We had, a lot of the groups that are represented at this conference today, public health groups, the firefighters, the nurses, teachers. Nonetheless, we didn't quite make it over the finish line, so you can just kind of tell the intensity of the opposition to these things. So moving forward into the coming legislative session, so as I'm sure most of you know, we have 2-year bienniums, so our bill will pick up right where it left off in 2018, so we just have to get one more vote on that bill that I described as 103, so we can get that interagency committee well testing and improving the Toxic Free Families Act to get toxics out of kids' products. There's other policies that we're also going to ask our legislators to look at this year. Some of them are legal tools that would give people in communities that have been impacted. So people like Jim and people in Bennington, let's make it easier for them to be able to collect damages, if their property value, for their health harm, if they have to get medical testing they never would have had to get, but for the fact that they have high levels of these chemicals in their body. And citizen suits, which is a tool that we have for a lot of federal environmental laws, but that's, hearing Jim's story about the government being unresponsive. If we had citizen suits, he could have sued ChemFab, the company, directly to enforce the law himself and demanded a response. So that's another tool that we're trying to look at. And the final thing we're looking at is, Shana had mentioned that these perfluorinated chemicals are used in things like popcorn bags. They're also used in fast food wrappers, pizza boxes. So we're saying, let's just get these chemicals out of these food products. And so we'll be looking at that as well. And we're looking at the entire class of chemicals because there's PFOA, there's PFOS, there's thousands of what they call these short chain perfluorinated chemicals. And this is one of the kind of tricks the industry does, is like tweak one chemical and then all of a sudden we've never done any testing on it, so we don't know if it's safe or not, but we'll assume it is until you can prove otherwise. And so we're saying let's get out of this mode of, replace one chemical with an almost identical one, but that's not regulated. And so we're looking at trying to get that whole class of chemicals out. So those are the things to keep an eye out for. But again, the importance of your voices, getting people involved in this issue, because we can really do a lot to better protect people here in Vermont with the abdication from the Trump administration. It's going to be on us for the next however long, but we really can make progress. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Our kids in the picture.
Yeah, that's Elizabeth.
We put them out there. Dress them up.
So
We still have your baby bottle, by the way.
Yeah.
Thought we might need it.
The final person I want to welcome up is Johanna de Grappenried, VPIRG's environmental advocate, who focuses on toxics reform as well as zero waste initiatives, regenerative ag, and issues affecting air and water quality in Vermont. And she's a decade of experience as an organizer, a campaigner, and advocate for social justice and environmental causes. So welcome, Johanna.
Thanks. So I first want to thank all of you for being here, for your interest in this issue, for the fact that you are all here today taking action on these really important topics. Without your participation, nothing happens on any of this, right? That's the deal. That's just how it works. Now, I also want to say we only have 5 minutes to talk about your action. Okay, so please stay involved. Please come talk to me afterwards about how you can continue to get involved in the issue about toxics regulation here in Vermont, and talk to Shana and to amazing representatives like Kaya and to your elected officials, because we are in a place where you actually can have an influence over your legislators. I'm used to working in places like North Carolina and West Virginia and Louisiana, where we have thousands of people who show up with drinking water in their hands that's poisoned, and those legislators still will not act. Here, if you make a phone call, if you have an in-district meeting with your legislator, if you write a letter to the editor and highlight a problem, it raises the profile of an issue to the point where there must be action. But we have to keep the heat on. So at all of your tables, there are these little sheets. Let's say Crossroads Conference has some questions on there about how you are going to take action on these issues. Please fill them out right now so that we can follow up with you about how you're going to influence your local legislators, how you are going to make sure that we pass S103 this session, and how we're going to continue to act to enact comprehensive toxic chemical reform.
here in Vermont.
If I may,
Yeah.
just a reminder again, the whole response to the PFOA in Bennington began because someone reached out. Had that person not said something, it wouldn't have even been on our radar.
Yeah, that's right.
So, thank you. So really, right now, while I'm talking, I won't feel like it's rude or disrespectful. Take a minute and fill this card out while I'm talking to you, because we don't have a lot of time, okay? So in here, we have a few opportunities, right? Things like calling your legislators, right? Coming to a lobby day during the legislative session. It's amazing that we have an open door policy in our legislature. Come up, come talk to your legislator, your representative, or your senator in the cafeteria while they're having lunch. You can totally do that. It's amazing. Make sure to write letters to the editor to your local paper and publish them in your local front porch forum. And then send them to us at VPIRG or to folks at TAC and to your legislators to make sure that we share them wide and far and that those voices are elevated to the rest of the public. Now, there's another great opportunity here, which is that there's going to be monthly check-in calls during a legislative session if you all are interested. This is how you can figure out whether or not these bills are actually moving and, hey, what is your legislator actually doing on them? Are they really being accountable to you and the public? Or are they kind of taking a little too far of a hint from industry and saying maybe we should put the brakes on for now? Do you all need to make a phone call today to make sure that it passes? It's a great opportunity to just get involved, and I promise I won't take too much of your time every month when we do it. And then lastly,
the last thing that you're talking about is we would be ostensibly making a call to listen in on a conversation with you about what's happening.
Shana, do you want to talk to that?
Like providing legislative updates. Yeah, so you can share the meetings that you have with your legislator. You know, folks like Johanna and Lauren can share what's happening in the State House, things like that.
Yeah. Lastly, y'all are bananas smart people. You have your own resources, your own intelligence, your own professional background, your networks, your skills. Please consider sharing them with us. We would be honored to work with you. That means anything from, I'm a really good writer, and I would love to talk to my neighbors about how to write a letter to the editor. Or, I am an amazing toxicologist, it turns out, and I would love to provide my skills and resources to you. Or, you know, I'm really, really good at social media. Or, I'm amazing at going through data. Or, I am really good at knocking on doors when it's 20 degrees outside, and I love it. And I want to make sure that my neighbors find out when there's an opportunity to take action. There's so many skills that all of the folks in this room have that when we work together, we can actually enact real change here in this state. It's why I moved here. It's why I'm so proud to live here. Can I get a quick time check?
I think that's 5. We were like,
we're done.
5:30.
So we're gonna win.
Make sure to pass those in before you leave.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry that we didn't get a chance to really talk more about these things. Y'all are great. We will follow up with you. Please do so. And if you have any questions, I've been requested that we do a hard stop right now, but I'm sure we could maybe take a question or two. Yeah.
I live in a 9-story apartment building in downtown Burlington with 108 apartments. And the water tastes so bad in the building that we have to have 3 commercial water filters. And every 2 days I go with a pot up in the elevator 2 floors to get a bottle of water so that I can have good drinking water. And in July, I went to visit Montreal, and it's like night and day. The water tastes so good up there and so bad in my apartment building. I wonder if it isn't one of these unknown chemicals that is affecting us. And we have cancer in the building too. And I wonder what the effect is there. Has anybody investigated this commercial water supply?
So, not as far as I know, right? Number one. I would say number 2, let's make sure that you are reaching out to the Bennington City Council, and let's have
This is Burlington.
Oh, the Burlington, excuse me, the Burlington City Council, and talk with folks like Shana at TAC who work directly with community members on that issue. And let's also make sure that your neighbors are getting together and talking about this with folks like us. Like, let's come talk to you. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Great. Other questions?
Like the contamination in Bennington, you're talking about the air quality. Was there a holding tank where this chemical was stored also? Or is it just
It's really complex. What happened was they had these dry towers that they were running, dry scrubber and no scrubber. That pollution was coming out and landing on the soil. This is very water soluble. It gets washed right down into the water table
So the point
right away.
source was the air.
And that was the major part of what was going on there. But they had a wet scrubber actually over on one of the ones in Hoosick. And the guy said, we used to open that thing up daily. And he said, you wouldn't believe how nasty the water was in that. So what did we do with it? We took it out back and dumped it on the ground.
We heard some of that from residents and people that work there. We don't have proof. That's what they said. It wouldn't be as dry.
It's coming my laboratory doesn't go into the ground, it's bacteria to the water.
Throw it off the backboard.
Oh, is it?
Rutland City,
It's probably worse. It's like.
One of the things we were concerned about was when we put in all our, we dug big trenches here and there for everything, and we dug up the roadbed. We took that soil to other places. Fortunately, we only took it within probably a half a mile of where we were. Then otherwise, somebody could have come back to us and said, our place was fine until you guys dumped this soil over here, you know? So it came, you know, it moved around in a lot of different ways.
I think I'll take one more question before we'll wrap up and head back. If there is one. Yeah.
I think to bring up the issue of the Vermont gas pipeline, the relationship to water issues around that. I'm so happy to see the government doing the right thing. But as someone who opposed the Vermont gas pipeline vigorously, I watched the government co-sign for that. I mean, the Department of Public Service, the Public Service Board, Public Utilities Commission, I consider that a rogue agency that is really in need of reform. And they basically forced the pipeline on people that didn't want it. And there are going to be water issues around that are going to be years to come. And fracking damages the water supply now. So I don't want to go on and on, but I would love to have that be part of this movement's conversation about clean water. I mean, I went to a clean water lobbying day last year at the Capitol, and the pipeline was not mentioned in the organizing that we did that day, and I was actually upset. So we have to be intersectional about the issues that we stick together. And I'll just close and say, you know, it's been a lesson for me like how impoverished we are today. The corporations have us so bad. We're the good people in our society. We're like huddling to stick together and like try and like get some justice. Yeah. It's pretty bad. We have to really reclaim the public sphere. And so anyway, hope you do.
Thank you so much for that close. Yeah, and I just want to close by, just let's thank everyone on the panel. So thank you guys all so much for coming out and for speaking so quickly about all the different things you want to get through. So thank you guys.
I would like to leave with you a few thoughts. One of the things that really got people moving was that they figured out that maple syrup was concentrated sap. And so the people, one of the things that they worried the most about was what's going to happen with our maple syrup. Well,
they were fine.
it's a big issue. Second thing, I've made a lot of phone calls and everything, and I can tell you, I got great responses from Leahy's office, Welch's office. Our buddy Bernie, no, he never gets back to anybody, so get with him, tell him to respond to people. Another thing, they had a moment of silence this morning for veterans, and as a veteran, I can tell you, thank you so much, but the time for silence on this stuff is over. Get up on your feet and talk to people who are on the other side of the issue. Try to change a mind here and there. And then, if they're in favor of smaller government, have them give me a call. I can tell you the government came to my rescue on this.
Thank you, Jen.